Okay, we're going to get started. So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Andrea Sampson. I am the CEO and moderator of today. I'm the CEO, sorry, of Talk Boutique and the moderator of today's Sense-Making Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, another week is coming to an end and more change is underway. In fact, we're seeing some changes that are starting to bring some memories of life prior to the pandemic. Now, some of you might be returning to your places of work, and we're seeing public spaces starting to be opened up. Now, of course, we all should be responsibly ensuring physical distancing is being maintained. However, it's been nice to be outside. I'm sure all of you are feeling the same as I have. We all need the sunshine, the warmer weather. I mean, our Canadian summers are pretty short. Well, with these changes, many of us are still experiencing career disruptions, whether that be actual changes in the jobs you're doing, or whether that's simply the fear that your skill set and experience may not be relevant in the near future. I mean, regardless of global pandemics, many of you, I'm sure, have been worried about this for some time. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of work, and we're going to be looking at the concept of career disruption and career ownership. The fact is, everyone is experiencing career disruption, whether we know it or not. For some, not much has changed on the surface. I mean, day-to-day duties and activities may remain the same, even if your workplace is somewhere now in your home office. But for others, all bets are off. I mean, routines are out the window and the day-to-day work has completely changed. Some will find your way. Others are going to be off-kilter for months, maybe even years to come. The question is, are you able to take ownership of how you'll navigate through this upheaval and change? And today, we're going to talk about this very thing and how you establish career ownership in chaotic times with our guest, Lisa Taylor. Lisa is a sought-after expert in helping companies recognize and adapt to changing career timelines and demographic composition. Lisa's expertise is widely recognized and regularly cited in many North American media sources, including the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, CBC, and Rogers. Her second, soon-to-be-published book is called The Talent Revolution. Lisa was recognized by the Urban Land Institute as one of Canada's top 100 women in 2014 for her work in leadership, employment, and city building. We're honored to have Lisa joining us today. Now, Lisa, help us to understand the concept of career ownership and how we can create just a bit more harmony as we navigate many of the changes underway.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, and hello to everybody that's joining us today. Career ownership happens to be one of my favorite topics to talk about, and coming at it from a sense-making perspective is such a great way for us to get into this topic. So I'm excited to jump right in. I think what I'll do is I'll take you through just a couple of opening remarks and some framing, some little thought pieces to drop along the way. For those of you that are live, if that sparks something that you want to put into chat for us to come back to later, that's perfectly all right. But I hope that it gets us thinking a little bit differently. My company is called Challenge Factory, and with a name like that, you can imagine that what we really look at focusing on is how do we address some of the biggest challenges that we're facing, especially as they relate to the world of work. So since 2011, we have been tracking this world of work and the changes that are happening since even long before Future of Work was a hashtag. And in our travels since that time, working in Canada and the US and internationally, we've recognized that there are 5 drivers that help us make sense of what is going on in the world of work. The 5 drivers allow us to have a lens or a comprehensiveness test when something happens to say, well, how does it impact each of these 5 things? And that allows us to make sense of things that otherwise feel too complicated. There's too many moving parts. We end up in conversations where people say, well, nobody knows how this is going to end up. The 5 drivers allow us to say, we may not know the end result, but we do know how to navigate and think our way through what we want the end result to be. So I'm going to start by sharing with you what these 5 drivers are, and you'll hear where career ownership fits. So the first of the 5 drivers that is shaping the future of work is demographics. Demographics says that not everyone is experiencing the changes in the same way at the same time. Within any particular change and shift that's happening, there is a need to take a look at it from a demographic lens. Sometimes that means from a generational lens. So how are different generations experiencing the change that's happening? Andrea, in my introduction, mentioned my book, which actually, I should give you an update, Andrea, but it is not just upcoming, but it is actually out and published, The Talent Revolution, Longevity, and the Future of Work. And that takes a very deep look at generational differences within the workforce. But as we know today, as we look within COVID times, there's other ways of looking at demographics to make sure that we really know who's winning and who's being left behind with any kind of shift and change that takes place. We may all be living through the same times, but we're not experiencing the same things together. And how do we capitalize on opportunities for everybody? So that's the first driver. The second driver is career ownership. And it is actually a very significant, impactful driver that affects every single individual and every single organization in the world of work today. Career ownership is the focus that says there is a change in the way employees and employers relate to each other. The power dynamic, the control structures, the way that we navigate through our careers over the course of our lifetime is not the same as it used to be. And who owns career? Who gets trained in the skills to have that type of career ownership? Who's even aware that they have power and control? And how does it get exercised becomes really important as we look at our own careers and for any of you that are managers in how you manage and lead others. The third driver takes a look at the impact of the freelance and gig economy. And I'll just leave that as a placeholder there. And if there's something of interest in that driver, or actually in the 4th and 5th, we can certainly address it later on in this session. And Andrea, I'm happy to answer questions about them as well. The 4th driver is platform-based business models and new ways of doing business. And certainly in COVID times, we are seeing a whole revolution in how we think about what business are we in, who do we serve, what problems do we solve, and what platforms do we use to get our message out. And finally, the 5th driver is AI, technology, and robotics. For those that are listening, you might actually think, well, how can you have a future of work conversation where AI, robotics, and technology get lumped in as the last discussion point with equal weight to some of the other topics? And it is a really important differentiator in how I think about the future of work, how Challenge Factory approaches it, and how any organizations that are engaging in our research and in our methodologies come to understand that the future of work is human. Oftentimes, future of work discussions get taken over by discussions about the future of technology in the workplace. And that's a really important conversation. It is interesting and dynamic and cool, and I started my career right in that space. But it does not talk about what is the actual application of human energy, effort, creativity that we want people to be focused on in the world of work. Instead, it takes a look to say what technologies exist and therefore what do we need to do. It puts technology in the driver's seat instead of humans in the driver's seat. And at where we're at in the future of work right at this moment, the future of work is still very much a human activity. The second thing that's emerging through the pandemic, which is really interesting, is the same way that technology has been at the forefront of future of work discussions, misplaced, and put in a bit of a different order. Today, real estate is emerging as a driver that is shaping future of work conversations. And again, like technology, the conversation about the future of real estate and workplaces, do we work from home or do we work in an office? Do offices get reconfigured and what does all of that look like? That's a very practical and tangible conversation that makes sense for us to be focused on right at this moment, but again, doesn't help us understand what is the future of work. Not where we work or how we work, but what do we do when we work? So with that setup of taking a look at 5 drivers and being able to take a lens on what is happening at any moment in time, let's dig in a little bit and look a little bit more deeply on career ownership. As I mentioned, the reason that career ownership is such an important topic is because it is the intersection point between how you relate to your career and what role you have in shaping it the way that you want it to play out, and what role employers have in demanding certain things of the workforce that works for them. Career paths and the way that we navigate through organizations didn't always exist the way that they do today. Sometimes structures come to be and we think, well, that's just the way the world has to be. But these are things that we create that come into being because at some point in time, they get started. And so in the 1970s, someone decided it would be a good idea for organizations to have career paths. Before that, the idea of a career path within an industry or a sector or a company didn't exist. And once that existed, it changed everything. Because now a company can say to you, you own your own career, you tell us what you'd like to do. But really, if there's a set defined career path to follow, what they're saying is you own your own career as long as it follows these steps. And if it doesn't, maybe we can help you find a path someplace else. In today's world of work, that power dynamic is shifting, and employees more than ever have much more control over how they will navigate over the full life course of their career, right from when they are in high school, all the way through to when they're in their 80s and still contributing into their communities. And with that power shift comes a need for individuals to know, how do you take control over your own career? What is it that your career has to have for it to be in your sweet spot? And for managers, how do I manage a workforce when I'm not solely in control of what they're going to want to do next anymore? These are all skill-based questions, and in Canada, career development is an underdeveloped skill and tool that we have in our toolkit. We aren't necessarily well trained in how to make career-related decisions for ourselves. We often give advice based on our own career path that's not necessarily relevant to the person that's asking for our guidance and advice. We don't turn to where there is really good approaches, methodologies, and research to back up how do you make a great career choice in a pandemic. So I'm happy to bring some of those tools to you and to be able to address any of the really hard or controversial questions that may be lurking. And I think maybe I'll pause my remarks there, and Andrea, let you take us wherever you think might be most useful. Andrea, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Quite all right.
So it's such an important conversation, the future of work and career ownership. And I know so many people right now are grappling with this as we are shifting and changing, as the world is shifting and changing. And, I think so many people feel like it's, it's personal. And so, if it's happening to everyone, why is that the case? Why does it feel so personal and so isolating?
It is an interesting dichotomy. Everyone has a career and everyone is navigating through changes, but our work is personal. It's tied to our identity. In Canada, we are #1 in the world for using our job title as a proxy when we meet each other and need to figure out who's who in the zoo. So if we were at a cocktail party and we were meeting for the first time, we would exchange names and then most likely exchange some sort of information about what do we do, what company do we work with, or what, how do we spend our days. And other countries don't do it that way. Other countries have other pieces of information that they immediately share, and the impact of having work being tied to that most important piece of information you share when you're trying to place people socially within our society is that it makes what you do integrated into who you are. And of course, you're not your job. You're not your title, you're not your company, you are much more than that. And if someone were to ask you, you would say, of course I am. But as a mantra, we repeat these things over and over and over again. And so when there is a disruption in our work that could potentially impact even how we introduce ourselves, is that actually still true? Can I still say that I work for that company or that I spend time in that industry? When that happens, it's really unsettling. And not just because work is important and it provides us with stability and security, it provides us with a sense of identity and purpose. And so it's that loss of identity and purpose that is being threatened that causes it to be a personal journey, that even if you're with three people who are all going through change at the same time, it doesn't always feel like they can understand what you're going through. It is a personal journey.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, and I think so many people right now, as we are, still in some degree of physical distancing, social isolation, call it, there's so many different words, sheltering in place. And we're feeling the isolation of, for some people working from home, but for others, their job is no longer exists. And that's a reality for some people. And those jobs may come back or they may not. And, so the redefinition of who you are it's difficult, right? And so, thinking about ourselves separate from our work is just not, it's interesting. It's just not the North American way, right? I know having done a lot of traveling myself, if you go to Italy, you're more likely to be asked questions like, are you happy? Versus what do you do? And I find that such an interesting shift. But, coming back to, looking at how we define ourselves by our career, if you are one of those people who perhaps the job has shifted and changed, or you perhaps were one of, already thinking about this beforehand, should we be waiting to change careers, or what should we be doing right now? Because this is there's a time when we can do things, but if we don't know where we're going, how do we even do anything about it?
It's such a strange time. On many, many webinars, conference sessions, over the last couple of weeks, I'll be leading a discussion where the group will have a chance to really engage and interact. And almost every time, someone will lob a question in that'll say, but I'm looking for a job and this is a terrible time to look for a job. So what should I do now? Should I keep looking, or should I put my job search on hold? Right along the lines of the question that you're asking, Andrea. And almost within minutes, someone else will lob a question in that'll say, well, I'm a hiring manager and I have jobs that are posted, but I don't know who's going to be looking for a job in this moment in time and want to onboard with a company when they can't come and see them in person. So should I put my hiring on hold? I think as we're getting farther into this situation, we're realizing that this is for the long term and everything needs to continue. So job seekers need to reevaluate and make sure they're very clear on what is it that you are looking for. No one can help you if you're not clear on exactly what it is that you're looking for, and you need to define that. You can define that by really understanding, what do you need from your work? What talents do you want to bring to your work? What do you care about? What gets you energized? And where are there market opportunities that you see that let you have the impact that you want to have? Where are there other job postings that are exactly like what you would want to go after? Bringing those 4 dimensions together and being really clear about what you're looking for will help other people, even in these situations, spread the word and help you find really incredible opportunities. And on the hiring side, you need to continue to hire too. I mean, if everybody ceases all business growth or even business operational activities, our economy, which is already taking a hit, will just become even more hit. So if you were going to be hiring, you need to continue in that process. And there are amazing candidates that are now out on the market and are looking for you. And there are fantastic resources and tools for how do you sustain your culture and onboard new staff in these specific times. And one caveat that I would make about that is, I hear a lot and I get asked a lot about what is the future of work in terms of making declarative statements based on what we're experiencing right now. So if I successfully onboard an employee remotely, does that mean we should always look at onboarding remotely from now on? Maybe that's a way we can move forward. And with that, what I would say in terms of what should we be pausing and what should we be going full steam ahead on right in this moment, full steam ahead on things that advance our own careers, full steam ahead on things that advance our own workforces, pause on making the declarative statements that say, and what we're experiencing right now is the future of work. This is not the future of work. This is the now of work in the midst of a crisis with all kinds of really unique and unbelievable circumstances. Let's not make the declaration for the future quite yet. There are ways for us to use this moment to do some smart experimentation and learning so that we actually shape a future that we design, as opposed to just inheriting conditions that we're currently living through.
I love that, the now of work versus the future of work. I think that's such an important statement to make and for people to hear, because I think there's a lot of fear around the future of work. And certainly, in your opening, you talked a little bit about technology and the fact that technology isn't the future of work either, right? Work is work. We, as humans, we do these things. And I think, there are many different ways in which we do work. And one of the things that I'm finding interesting, and actually before I go into the question, I actually just want to remind participants, hey, chime in. We want to hear from you. So I forgot to give you this prompt, but make sure you're typing your questions into the chat bar. I'm monitoring it, so I will absolutely make sure your questions get to Lisa. So go ahead, and I'm sure that she's prompting some big questions because I know she is for me. Where I was going to go with this, though, is looking at the fact that today we have a multi-generational workforce out there, and it creates challenges, in the best of times, because we all have different ways in which we work. And I think now in this place where that workforce is having to work in different ways, using technologies that may be less or more familiar for them. What advice can you give to help us work better together? And even as we look forward in these careers, regardless of the generation we're in, what could that forward looking look like from the standpoint of multi-generational working? And the way in which the workforce will need to be in the future.
Yeah, so intergenerational work, and you'll hear I've switched the language because intergeneration looks at how the generations work together. Multi-generation means many generations, and it serves to identify how they're distinct from each other. So rather than saying boomers are like this and Gen X is like that, intergenerational looks to say how can they learn and grow from each other in a way that's symbiotic and actually increases the productivity and output of the entire organization. So the intergenerational workforce really has some interesting dynamics, and they're not necessarily what you would expect. So the technology burden is an interesting one, and every generation struggles with the use of technology in different ways. For some, there's new technologies that they may not necessarily have been exposed to, although they were the generation that created most of the technologies that are the backbone of technology that's being used in business today. For others, they may be really comfortable using the technology, but don't have the context or experience to know how to use them well to develop business relationships or to be able to develop deep trust and partnership. So there's all different lenses that we can take to this intersection point of how technology is a tool that advances the work that we do and the careers that we do. It serves in powerful ways to bring people together. We can use lots of recent examples of how we've been able to connect with each other over music and creative endeavors, in webinars and webcasts like this, in very meaningful conversations, in check-ins with each other. And so it is a very powerful force. I don't want to minimize the role that technology plays in work and across the generations. And I also don't want to necessarily draw into stereotypes that says, and it will be more or less of an issue for one generation or another. Its application is something that all generations need to learn from each other. So I'll give you an example that's starting to emerge related to technology and remote work. So there is a hypothesis that's starting to emerge that says that remote working may be possible longer term. It's possible. and that future generations, as we continue to advance our work in upcoming weeks and months and years, will rely more heavily on a hybrid approach of working remotely versus working in core office space. And those that are used to using remote technologies to keep in touch with their friends and to engage, the younger generations perhaps, may be really suited to be able to jump into these types of arrangements. But there's a counterpoint that's also part of the ongoing hypothesis that says the reason that we've been able to engage with each other so effectively over these last couple of weeks and months is because while we've jumped into remote working and remote relating, we already had an existing relationship. And we already knew each other through many face-to-face and personal interactions. And is that foundation, that experience, actually prioritizing and advantaging older generations in remote work as opposed to younger generations? So it's one of the things that it's a great example of where I wouldn't want us to jump to any declarative conclusion at this moment in time on whether a trend or a piece of what's happening now is good or bad for any particular generation. Generations aren't exactly the same. Not everybody that's my age approaches technology the same way as I do. I had a 12-year technology career, others didn't. Some teenagers really despise the use of social media and others are on it all the time. So we can't really make broad sweeping general discussions, but it's why in the 5 drivers that we use to make sense of the future of work, taking a demographic lens and doing some good analysis on who's being advantaged and who's being left behind becomes a precursor to then knowing and what will the career impact be.
Yeah, fair. And I think that's, I love the distinction, intergenerational versus multi-generational, and helping us to really see how these, how this works together. And it's really about understanding the individual. You know, you brought up, and I think, you know, many of us have heard about different organizations who are making sort of broad sweeping statements around remote work. Twitter has announced it will consistently be a work from home. Shopify has done the same. And, you know, this is going to have some sort of far-reaching implications, and not just on a generational standpoint, but, you know, in general for the way in which we work together. And, you know, I start to think about, you know, skill sets and experience when I start thinking about, well, suddenly, you know, my little corner in my condo has now become the place in which I'm showing up for work every day.
Worldwide headquarters.
In worldwide headquarters, absolutely. And so when you start thinking about these, you know, remote work becoming the new norm, and the skill sets and experience that's required. Tell me a little bit about that as we look to the future. What can that start to look like? How can people make sure that they are prepared?
So where we do our work and how we do our work is a function of what work are we doing. So the starting point needs to be, what is your work? What's your purpose? What does it mean to do it well? How are you rewarded for that? And how does that fit into your own sweet spot of what you need from work, what you're talented in, what you care about, and where the market is? As we look at these declarative statements that are coming out, specifically around real estate-based remote work and that balance of where we're going to be working, but you can relate it to anything. What always goes through my mind is that there's multiple ways that we can approach different types of challenges, but there's 2 models in particular that seem to emerge. The first is to approach problems as if they're a puzzle that needs to be solved. And we get the border pieces in place, and then we put all the rest of the pieces. So in your question, that's what I hear. If the new border is going to be more working from home, then what are the skills? What are the pieces that I need to put into that puzzle? The issue with solving problems as puzzles is someone else gets to define that border, and then we react as if the picture on the box is the only picture that we should be working towards. As opposed to taking a step back and in moments of disruption, applying more of a scientific method. Science wouldn't approach a problem that way. Science would approach the problem to say, let's approach it as a mystery. Let's set some hypotheses and questions that we have, and then let's watch for the clues that help us know if we're on the right path. And as the clues emerge, the image that we have of the problem we're trying to solve will change. So we don't consistently try to solve a static problem. We adjust and adapt depending on the data that we get, the environmental changes, and the other variables that are a part of our experiment. And I think, this is a model that I learned from a colleague, Dr. Nazreen Khatri, many years ago. And it has always been a part of Challenge Factory's thinking, but especially in these COVID times, to watch the difference between business thinking towards the future of work, trying to solve it as a puzzle, and alongside a public health pandemic where science and science process is rolling out all around us, taking a look to see how could we apply that type of thinking to what we're going to expect next is really fascinating. So what that would look like for your own career is, instead of trying to define the endpoint, set out what questions you need to have answered over the next couple of weeks that'll give you the clues to know if you're on the right track, and be ready to adjust. And I think that that is a much stronger position to be at, because things are continuing to shift and change, and it's the way to capitalize on the best opportunity for you.
So, I mean, really, as I hear that, what I hear is that, we're in a situation of it's a complex problem. And, we've got complicated problems, and we've got complex problems, and complex problems mean that the next step is defined in some cases by the last step we took. So we can't determine that next step until we take the last step. So we're always only working in a place where we can only make the decision that's right in front of us. The next one will present itself when it comes. We can't really think it through. So that's, and I think that that's important, right? That gives us some freedom to say, it's okay to just think about where you are right now in this moment and make the right decision for you, whether that be from a job that may be being presented to you, whether it's from a skilling perspective, or whether it's from a mental health perspective, because all of these things, of course, we know are at play right now in real time. So making the decision that's present right now is enough. And
taking it one step at a time, I think, is a really important way to just take the temperature down and take the stress down. So there's nothing wrong with having long-term goals. I don't want anyone to take from that it doesn't make sense to have longer-term career aspirations and goals. Of course it does. But in terms of how do you get yourself motivated on Monday morning to actually take a step in a world that seems overwhelming and complicated and confusing, where everything feels hard, you do need to break it down a little bit and set goals that are a little bit shorter than, how am I going to solve my entire career for my entire life right in this moment in time? And in one really practical sense, that is advice that's often given to job seekers, is really one step at a time. Like, the job of submitting your resume, the job of a connection is to get them to say, can you send me your resume? The job of sending your resume is to get an interview. The job of the interview is to get to the second interview. Like, one step at a time, your goal is to get to the next step. If you start with the only goal being landing the job, there's so many variables along the way there that you might actually miss a really great opportunity, because you're so focused on that endpoint, you miss something else that comes up for you along the way.
Prior to all of us working from home, and in that before time, we saw a lot of discussion and a lot of conversation happening around the gig economy. And many people prior to the pandemic that had made the choice to move out of full-time work and move into this freelance or gig-based job market. And the pandemic has had sort of differing effects on the gig economy, because depending on what you do, of course, you may either be thriving and doing great, or really having nothing at all to do. But talk to me a little bit about the gig economy and how it will impact the future, the now of work, and the future of work.
Yeah, so the gig economy, or the freelance economy, is a really interesting phenomenon. And depending on whose research you look at and at what point in time, it either is or isn't thriving. So 4 or 5 years ago, a study came out that said, a majority of American workers by the year 2020 will be in a freelance or gig type role. The foundation for that research was never necessarily exactly solid. We're in 2020, we didn't hit the number, but that report has been shared and circulated as the foundation for all kinds of conversations and structures about what the future of the freelance economy versus full-time work would look like. It set the frame in that puzzle that then got everyone to try to start to put the puzzle pieces together without ever questioning, is that actually the frame, the picture on the box that we're trying to go for? So how strong the gig economy is, how much of a choice people that are in a gig economy work, how much of a choice have they made? Is it a career ownership decision to move into or not? Who's being left behind? Is it decent work and fair work, or is it an alternative model? All of these things have been in discussion for the last number of years, and the pandemic has really just put them into focus. Because for some, the gig economy is a phenomenal opportunity, and it provides an amazing way to balance all kinds of interests and work, to advance expertise, and to be quite lucrative. And for others, it's an alternate employment mechanism that never quite puts all the pieces together enough for you to have stability and security within your own job and career. And what we're seeing is a real difference between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to this freelance economy. And sector by sector, I think we're going to start to see adjustments. I know the nonprofit sector, for example, has had an initiative over the last 2 years or even longer called Decent Work, led by Imagine Canada and by the Ontario Nonprofit Network, to take a look and really examine what is decent work within the sector and how does that relate to some of these alternate job functions. Other sectors are going to be looking at that as well. And certainly all of the discussions around benefits as they've been rolling out and who qualifies and who doesn't is bringing this to the fore. I don't think freelance work is going away. I think what is going to happen is we need to take a look at how do we normalize it, and what does it mean to have a career that is predominantly freelance and still requires stability.
Yeah, I mean, I come from advertising, which, has always had a very large freelance component to it because it's just the nature of the work. And, I think that all of what you've just described, those of us who come out of that industry have certainly experienced that, decent work, the idea of it being fair, the concept of benefits. These are all big questions in the freelance or gig economy. And, as we're seeing technology start to play into what it is that we do, and the question of artificial intelligence and its ability to do some of what it is we do. Talk a little bit about what could technology look like, or how might technology impact the way in which we work, in the now and in the very near future.
So technology has a huge impact, and really what I like to look at is there's two ways to look at technology. Technology determinism, which was a Marxist approach and started way earlier than Karl Marx, but it basically says if technology exists, then we must deploy it, and its use then defines what we're able to do. So technology determines the work and the output and productivity of a society. The alternative is to say, what work do we want to be doing? What human capacity do we have for creativity and innovation that we could free up if we had some of the other pieces of work that is currently being done by using technology? And we've seen lots of examples of where that has taken place, where things that are routine, that can be automated, end up being automated. The trick and the challenge is, if the goal is to unleash human potential so that we continue to advance, how do we do that in a way so that as we're replacing work, as we're replacing workers with technology, we're also replacing work with more and more advanced, meaningful work. And a lot of times the discussion becomes one of class or of privilege, where people say, well, that's great if you have an education, or that's great if you're in a certain location or city, but there's a lot of communities that get left behind in that discussion. And I'm not sure that it needs to be that way. I think as we look at the future of work, we need to be focused on shaping what is it that we want to be true, and how do we do that in a way that we don't leave people behind. If there's an assumption that people are going to be left behind, we will absolutely create systems and structures that leave people behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a challenge that is often seen as overly optimistic or naive, and yet I think it is the only lens that we can take that actually moves us to an end result, which is something that we would want to have in place for not just our own work, but if we imagine the work environments that our children or our children's children are going to be living in, that's what we should be going for. We should be aiming for something that would make us happy to know that that's what they're doing, and then make it true today.
Yeah, I think, honestly, the concept of meaningful work is the piece that gets missed so much when that conversation comes up. And, the idea that all work is meaningful is important. And it's also important to understand, I think, that, as we look at every major evolution in humanity, we've always seen work shift. So, every time we've had another advance in our industrial revolutions, we've seen some work go away, right, and new work emerge. And this is no different. We're sort of in that place where we're starting to see new work emerge. And it's not that people will suddenly find themselves unskilled or, not able to do the work. We are, in fact, in that place of transition. And I think that's what we're experiencing right now.
I think it ties back to our topic for today. Yeah. I mean, it comes back to career ownership. And, is this wave of change something that's going to happen to you, that's going to leave you feeling powerless and out of options? Or are there ways that we can actually increase the career agency that everyone has, the tools that we have to be able to actually know, how can I make a difference for myself in my own career, living in the city I live in, with the history I have, with the background that I have in the sector that I work in, so that more Canadians and more North Americans, more people around the world, but really our focus is in North America, more North Americans take ownership over what they want to have happen next, and not feel like it's impossible or someone else is going to take all of the power and make all of the decisions. We can be in charge of our own careers, but that takes a very unique approach, mindset, skill set, and supports. And we need to do more of that. We know that there's high school guidance counselors that deliver this type of advice in our high schools. There's campus career centers. But other developed nations have lifelong career guidance that takes place all the way through your entire career, and not just when a catastrophe strikes, not just when you become ill or injured and you can't do the job or you lose your job. It actually is a lifelong check-in that happens on a regular basis. Who are you? What talents do you have? What do you care about? And how does it connect to the marketplace? And what do you want to be doing next with it? And a choice to stay exactly where you are is just as valid as a choice to make radical change. Not everyone has to make radical career change, but everyone needs to know that that is actually their choice. And they have ways that they can exercise those options.
Lisa, this has been absolutely fascinating. Career ownership and the ability for each of us to take control is such an important message. Thank you so much for sharing with us all of your knowledge. So clear, because clearly you are an expert. And I know I've got more questions. I know my colleagues who are on the line with us today have more questions. And we're going to bring you back next week, next Wednesday, to take more questions. So on our Changemaker 20, my colleague Daniel Maznabi will be talking to you a little bit more about career ownership and what that could look like. And for all of you who are listening today, clearly Lisa is an expert in this area. And if you are interested in having her come in and speak at your place of work, or through your organizations, please let us know. We would love to work with you on that and to get Lisa out there speaking to you, because her message needs to be heard by everyone. It is so incredibly, incredibly important. Thank you for joining us. Next week, we have Sandra Elia, who joined us a few weeks back on our Changemaker 20. Sandra is expert in the area of communicating how we eat and what we eat and why we eat. And for many of us, I think we may have been doing a little bit more eating than we should have, perhaps, over this pandemic. So join us on Friday for our sense-making conversation with Sandra Elia, next Wednesday for our Changemaker 20 with our guest today, Lisa Taylor. And thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay connected, and keep those conversations going. Have a beautiful weekend, all. Take care.